Before the sun was fully up on Friday, October 13, 1307, royal agents across France were already moving. Orders had been sealed in advance. Names had been compiled. Doors were approached in darkness. By morning, one of the most trusted financial networks in Europe was being broken open all at once. Not by a panic, not by a failed harvest, not by a run on deposits, by the crown. This is the part modern people often miss. The Templars did not look fragile. They looked untouchable. They had fortresses. They had land. They had an international reputation for discipline, secrecy, and cross-border trust. Kings stored assets with them. Pilgrims and nobles used their transfer system to move value without carrying coin across bandit roads and war zones. In a world of distance and danger, they made trust portable, and that is exactly why their destruction matters now, because the institution that seemed safest was sitting too close to a sovereign that was running out of room. Philip IV of France had already shown the pattern: fiscal pressure, political aggression, social resentment, coin manipulation, confiscation. The state was short of honest options. The Templars were rich, centralized, visible, and legally vulnerable the moment the king decided accusation would be cheaper than repayment. The official story was heresy. The forensic story was something colder. A sovereign debtor found a way to turn creditors into criminals, and once you see that mechanism clearly, this stops being a medieval curiosity. It becomes a permanent warning. Your wealth is not secure because a vault is thick. It is secure only until the political system around that vault decides your protection is less important than its own survival. To understand why this mattered, you have to strip away the mythology and look at the function. The Templars were not a bank in the modern chartered sense. They did not look like a retail bank, issue consumer loans the way a modern lender does, or operate under anything like contemporary regulation. What they built was something earlier and, for its time, astonishingly powerful. A trusted transnational infrastructure for deposit, transfer, custody, and settlement across a fractured continent. A noble, a bishop, a merchant, or a pilgrim could place valuables with one Templar house and recover value elsewhere through the order's internal network. That mattered because medieval Europe was politically fragmented, physically dangerous, and legally inconsistent. The Templars made distance less dangerous by making institutional trust travel farther than armed escorts could. That is why they became so useful to elites. They held deposits. They guarded charters, bullion, relics, and sensitive records. They maintained fortified houses in strategic locations. They were disciplined, literate, and connected across kingdoms. In practical terms, they helped solve three problems that ruin commerce in unstable periods: how to store wealth, how to move wealth, and how to prove entitlement to wealth when you arrive. In an age of clipped coin, local tolls, brigandage, and war, that was not convenience. It was civilizational infrastructure. This is the first forensic lesson. People usually imagine financial fragility as a weak institution with bad assets and thin reserves, but the Templars show the opposite danger. An institution can look strong precisely because it has concentrated trust. The more a network becomes the preferred vault, archive, and transfer rail for a ruling class, the more attractive it becomes in a sovereign emergency. Strength can become target selection. Centrality can become fatal visibility. That is not speculation here. That is the pattern the next chapters will show. And the crown knew exactly what kind of machine it was looking at. Philip IV was not attacking an obscure religious house. He was moving against an order that sat close to money, records, land, and royal finance. The irony is severe. During the monetary turmoil of 1306, when Paris rioted after Philip's currency measures, the king himself reportedly took refuge in the Paris Temple. He understood both the physical security and the symbolic authority of the institution. He knew where trust had accumulated. So when people ask how the first great cross-border trust network could vanish so quickly, the answer is not that its faults failed. Its legal perimeter failed, and that is a much more modern problem than most viewers want to admit. Now look at the sovereign on the other side of this relationship. Philip IV did not wake up one morning with a sudden moral revelation about the Templars. He had a fiscal problem. War against England and prolonged conflict in Flanders strained the crown's resources, and his reign became associated with increasingly aggressive extraction, heavier taxation, monetary manipulation, expulsions, and confiscations. This is the second forensic lesson. Before the legal strike comes the balance sheet stress. Before the accusation comes the funding problem. One of the clearest warning signs was coinage. Philip's government repeatedly tampered with money, and the shock was not abstract. When a ruler debases, revalues, or otherwise disturbs the unit people use to measure wages, rents, and debts, the pain shows up first in daily life. Prices dislocate. Debts are repaid in a different monetary reality than the one in which they were incurred. Trust becomes a moving target. In 1366, Philip's currency measures helped trigger unrest in Paris so severe that he reportedly took refuge in the Paris Temple itself. The image is almost too perfect. The sovereign sheltering inside the fortress of the institution he would later destroy, and Philip had already tested other extraction methods. Britannica notes that in 1306 he expelled the Jews from France and seized their property. Other reference sources describe the same reign as one marked by forced loans, high taxes, and confiscatory finance under wartime pressure. The point is not to stack moral charges. The point is to identify sequence. When a state begins harvesting politically weak balance sheets, it is often rehearsing for larger seizures later. First come those with the least protection, then come those with the most assets. This is where your pattern interrupt belongs. Have you ever checked what sits on your bank's asset side and asked how much of it is really a claim on the state? Because once a financial institution is deeply entangled with sovereign paper, sovereign guarantees, sovereign liquidity windows, and sovereign regulation, you are no longer dealing with private risk alone. You are dealing with a structure whose stability depends on the same authority that can change the rules under stress. That is the modern echo of the Templar problem. The names are different. The accounting is more sophisticated. The legal wrappers are thicker. But the core issue is unchanged. Concentration near sovereign power creates hidden fragility. This last sentence is an inference from the historical pattern rather than a direct quotation, but it is exactly what the record suggests. By Lung 37-7, Philip had motive, precedent, and practice. He had already shown that when honest repayment was difficult, coercion could be made to look like policy. Then came the strike, not a riot, not a spontaneous purge, a coordinated state operation. On September 14, 1377, Philip IV sent secret instructions to royal officials across France. The orders were not public. They were sealed, distributed in advance, and timed for simultaneous execution. Then, at dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, royal agents moved across the kingdom and arrested Templars en masse, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay. Hearings began within days. Confessions followed under pressure. The speed matters because it tells you this was not an investigation discovering a crime. It was a decision constructing one. And look at the choice of charge. The Crown did not accuse the Templars of being overexposed to royal credit risk. It did not announce that the monarchy had become dangerously dependent on extraordinary extraction. It accused them of heresy, blasphemy, and obscene initiation rites. That was not random. Moral charges perform a very specific function in confiscatory politics. They make seizure feel righteous. Once the public believes the target is impure, predatory, or treasonous, ordinary legal protections become easier to suspend. Outrage becomes fiscal cover. That is the forensic core of this story. A sovereign debtor did not merely attack a creditor. It changed the category of the creditor. It transformed a financial counterparty into a moral threat, and once that conversion is accepted, Asset seizure stops looking like default and starts looking like justice. That is how states preserve legitimacy while doing something fundamentally extractive. This is an inference from the historical record, but it fits the sequence unusually well. Now place beside that a brief modern parallel. Carefully, today governments do not usually send mounted officers to pre-dawn chapter houses and accuse bankers of idol worship. The language is different. The mechanism of immobilization is not. In modern systems, authorities can freeze property under sanctions and related enforcement regimes. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control states plainly that blocking means freezing assets or other property and prohibits transfers or dealings with that property. In the United Kingdom, financial sanctions guidance similarly lays out the state's authority to restrict access to funds and economic resources. Those powers exist for reasons governments consider serious. The point is not that every freeze is illegitimate. The point is that legal access to your own assets can disappear long before any final moral consensus exists. That is why the Templar lesson still bites. If the entity above the system decides your category has changed, fortress walls do very little. The real perimeter is legal, not physical. This is the flaw in every fortress model of wealth preservation. People think security means thickness. Thicker walls, heavier doors, more guards, better vaulting, harder access. The Templars had all of that, and it did not save them, because their final vulnerability was never architectural. It was jurisdictional. They were secure against thieves, raiders, and ordinary coercion. They were not secure against the authority that could define guilt, seize persons, freeze operations, and convert extraordinary action into lawful procedure. The institution attacking them did not need to crack the vault. It only needed to control the meaning of ownership. That distinction matters more now than most people realize. A modern depositor often imagines his money as sitting in a place. In reality, much of his wealth exists as a claim inside a layered legal and administrative system. Bank liabilities, custodial promises, clearing relationships, sovereign backstops, reporting rules, and emergency powers. The physical imagery remains comforting, but the real asset is access. If access can be delayed, conditioned, reviewed, frozen, inflated away, or subordinated to state priorities, then nominal ownership and usable ownership are no longer the same thing. This is an inference from the structure of modern finance, but it is exactly the logic the Templar case exposes. Street level, this is where collapse becomes personal. It looks like payroll arriving late while prices move first. It looks like a transfer pending for days because someone wants another document. It looks like a small business unable to pay suppliers even though the balance still appears on the screen. It looks like a family with property on paper and no liquid means to solve an immediate problem. In stressed systems, people do not suffer first from total extinction of wealth. They suffer from interruption of use. The first trapped are usually those whose assets are concentrated inside institutions that cannot act independently of the state. The first adapters are the ones who understand, early, that survivability depends on optionality. This is a synthesis of the historical pattern rather than a claim from one single source. The Templars learned the hardest version of that lesson. An impenetrable vault is worthless when the attacker owns the law around it. So what survives this pattern? Not bravado. Not slogans, not blind faith in institutions that are safe only in calm weather. The forensic record points to something less dramatic and more demanding. Do not concentrate your financial life inside a single legal box. Do not let all liquidity, all custody, all counterparties, and all emergency access depend on the same sovereign perimeter. Do not confuse account statements with resilience. A number on a screen is not the same as money you can use under pressure. That does not mean fleeing every institution, hiding gold in the walls, or living in permanent paranoia. It means building layers. Some liquidity that is immediately reachable. Some assets outside the most obvious points of administrative friction. Some diversification of custodians, jurisdictions, and legal dependencies. And above all, an honest audit of how much of your current security is really just confidence that the rules will remain friendly, because that is what the Templars misjudged. They built for theft, but not for reclassification. They built for attack from outside the gates, not from above the law. Their fortress was real. Their protection was conditional. That is the warning. When the sovereign is stressed, morality can become theater. Legality can become strategy, and private capital can become available inventory. You do not need to predict the next version of that event. You only need to recognize the structure early enough to avoid being trapped inside it. In the end, the choice is brutally simple. You can hold wealth where it is easiest for the system to see, freeze, and repurpose. Or you can hold at least part of your life in forms and places that give you a fighting chance when the story changes.